You're listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent. My name's Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the pod. If you are new and you don't know our website, then just hit pause a second, why don't you, and go to theafricareport.com to get a feel for what our day job is. Glad to have you back. For all of those of you who are regular listeners, thanks for all your kind comments on our latest podcast, a conversation with the Ethiopian author Mazar Mengiste, author of The Shadow King and Beneath the Lion's Gaze. Do go and check that out. On the pod this week, Tibor Nagy, the US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Nagy has been the American ambassador to Guinea and to Ethiopia. After retiring from the Foreign Service, Nagy worked in academia before being called back by Donald Trump in May 2018. It's a time of contrasts for the US in Africa. For a long time, Washington was accused of only having a security-minded approach to the continent, but French army officials were alarmed to read recently that the US was withdrawing troops and matériel from West Africa. And though the mood music may be more visa bans and talk of SH fill-in-the-blank whole countries, the US has created a new aid agency aimed at Africa and doubled its budget to $60 billion. Likewise, though people criticize the China lens through which Washington now scrutinizes Africa, they have also resurrected the US Exim Bank and created a Prosper Africa initiative.
The decisions that we all collectively make now is going to pretty well determine which direction that what I call a youth tsunami goes in. Development theory is fine, but how does a country truly develop? We can look at the Chinese model, we can look at the South Korean model, it develops through private investment because there's so much more global private investment available than you put all the development assistance together. It's a little bucket compared to a monsoon rain with the private sector investment. So how do you get private sector investment? Because they create the jobs. It's not development assistance that creates the jobs, it's private sector investment. Well, it's two-sided. Some countries, for example, the Chinese, because of the structure of the state, the Chinese leadership can say to a state-owned company, go to the Gambia and do X, or you go here and do X. United States and France also, our leadership can't do that because the private sector makes its own investment decisions. They're looking throughout the world for opportunities, most of these companies. So how do they end up in Africa? That's where the African leadership has a responsibility of putting in place the type of environment which is welcoming to businesses that are very responsible, that believe in a fair process, that believe in the sanctity of contracts, that don't believe in paying people off, to get the job. But then these companies, yours, ours, create employment. They're very responsible. They take care of the environment. They don't smuggle out ivory. They follow the rules. And so to me, that is a key. It's economic expansion. Now, the Africans have been very helpful this past year. Look at what the African Union has done with the continent-wide free trade agreement. That has come about so much faster than anyone hoped. But there again, the big question is going to be implementation. Because you can have the best free trade agreement, on a piece of paper, but if some poor truck driver tries driving across 3 borders and every 1,000 meters there's a rope with people with uniforms that make him pay a bribe, so there again the implementation is going to be extremely critical. Luckily, again, I said that for probably the first time, the White House, State Department, USAID, all are on this economic development, private sector investment as the appropriate way. USAID Administrator Mark Green, his whole theme is Journey to Self-Reliance. Again, when do you pass from developing to developed? That's the goal. It's when USAID was created, it was meant to be a temporary agency that would put itself out of business. But no one took that really seriously until the new administrator. But then the financial instruments too.
Yeah.
Development Finance Corporation, $60 billion, for projects, including equity projects, which Africa sorely needs, are some equity projects along with the debt. So,
speaking to someone from the Atlantic Council, they said, that there has been this doubling of OPIC. There is this, new renewed focus, and yet it's still really the old American companies, the GEs, Coca-Colas, who are present. And while there may be some mature fintech investment like MasterCard or Visa, actually, to get that second wave of American SMEs into the continent, you're going to have to go and get them. You're going to have to go to Kansas City,
I totally
do the road
not
shows,
only Kansas
do the
City. I totally agree with you, because I'm Hungarian, but my U.S. home is West Texas.
Sure.
And I always use that as an example with the folks as I'd like to get the West Texas companies, the Kansas companies, the small and medium-sized enterprises, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that create the most business. And to get them, and this is where the next initiative comes in, which we call Prosper Africa. Mm-hmm. Because, for decades, those of us who took this seriously would go visit ministers of finance. I remember in a couple of countries I would do that and say, you need to introduce a guichet unique. Well, the sad truth is that the U.S. government never had a guichet unique for U.S. business people wanting to go to Africa. That's when you get the small companies from Kansas City, Oklahoma City to be interested in Africa, is if there's a single point in the U.S. with the U.S. government for them to go to see, okay, how can I connect with the embassy in Lomé to tell me about opportunities in Togo or to tell me about the business environment? Well, that's the whole concept behind Prosper Africa, is to bring all of I think there's 19 or 9, or I forget the exact number of U.S. government agencies that have something to do with Africa, to not physically put them together, but thanks to technology, to put them together under the digital umbrella. So, through the web, you can actually use the resources of all of those agencies to become engaged with Africa. But then the other side of Prosper Africa is every single one of our embassies. We have formed deal teams, which means that every single person in the embassy, from the first tour officer to the ambassador, is going to give a priority to increasing trade and investment, which means helping the companies that are looking, but it also means engaging with the host government, to be very honest with the host government, to say, you want more, Western businesses? Here's what you need to do. Like one of my favorite things, whenever I travel, I meet with the American business community, and I ask them about how things really are. And one of the things I found out from a couple of countries is that the tax people in the country are paid by how much they challenge, not how much they collect. But they can go to a company and say, you owe $3 million. And that's what their bonus is paid on, not how much they actually collect. So they give considerable pain to companies to then have to dispute the fact. And instead of broadening the tax base by bringing in more and more companies, what they often do is go after the same companies over and over and over again. I just read in a publication that Nigeria, how many people there are in Nigeria, collects the same amount of tax revenue every year as Luxembourg.
Wow. Who are not noted for tax collection.
So it was in a very responsible publication, so I'm assuming that it's, the veracity.
They collect 4% tax or something.
So that's where, that goes to the heart of how do you put in a better business environment that's welcoming to everybody, not just certain countries who don't mind opaque business practices, who don't mind special consultant fees and things like that, because your companies and ours are their rules of behavior are totally different.
Possibly, although, without, much effort, I think, on both the French and the US side, we could find counterexamples to that. But nevertheless, just like France, the US is kind of being marginalized to an extent in Africa, with just by this the size of the new crowd who are getting interested in the continent. It's not just Russia having a Russia Africa.
Yeah.
Turkey's got one this year. Of course, China, India as well. What exactly?
Here's the thing: there's enough business for everybody, and
Sure.
and at the end of the day, U.S. businesses have a unique advantage globally in a way that the American domestic market is so huge. And here's the deal: if you're comfortable doing business in the United States and your return on investment in the U.S. is at a certain percent, you would need so much more to go off in a frontier market. And so part of my job is to show our business people that, yes, it is very much worthwhile for them to look at this frontier market, especially in certain kinds of industries. I mean, I don't know if you follow the travels of our Secretary of State, but he's spending this week in Palo Alto, California, Silicon Valley, engaging with our digital companies, which again, it's exactly the kinds of investment Africa needs, because Africa has consistently been behind in technology, but we're at a stage of our technological advancement where they could leapfrog, as they have done with cell phones. Because remember, for decades, everyone would say, well, Africa doesn't have phones, you have to wait 8 months to get this, blah, blah, And then all of a sudden, the cell phones are there.
Absolutely. But the VC community and the venture capital community in the US is very switched on to opportunities in Africa.
Yeah.
But what kind of impacts would, having mid-sized or even small agro-processing SMEs from the US come to Africa? Because that's the huge opportunity. It's the thing that'll drive employment.
They need the Development Finance Corporation type of funding. And they need the welcome mat from the African side, and they need the hand-holding that the U.S. government can provide. That's where we have been negligent, and that's one of the things that Prosper Africa is looking at very seriously, is the hand-holding. Because American companies have been very comfortable dealing, obviously, in Canada, in Mexico, even in Latin America. But Africa has been kind of that last frontier. Asia to a large extent because of the huge Chinese market, India, as they have become more business friendly, and of course the Japans and even the Vietnams and the others. But it's been, Africa that has been out there because first there was a global competition between the West and the evil empire of the Soviet Union.
Sure.
Then there was a sense of the chasse gardée by not just the French, but the former colonial powers that, the British they had advantages in Nigeria, the French had it in Francophone Africa, the Portuguese had it in Lusophone Africa. But now the Africans have so many choices to go to.
It's a positive thing.
Yes,
I agree.
If it's handled appropriately and if it's handled in the interest of the countries and not narrow elite sectors.
Sure. There can be a feeling from the African leaders I speak to that while Prosper Africa is welcome, it was introduced in a speech where China was mentioned, I don't know how many times, and it does seem to be that the security prism comes first, and that's why Africa's been bumped slightly up.
I mean, for the United States, there is global power competition. And there are many facets of global power competition. It's a very complicated relationship, as is obvious yesterday when we signed with the Chinese. I don't want to call it a trade agreement.
Phase one of the trade deal.
Phase one on the one hand. On the other hand, our leadership has made some very frank and direct speeches regarding the various facets of the global power competition. And that is being played out everywhere, most especially in places like Africa, because of the rapidly expanding economies there, the rapidly expanding consumer populations, and that there has not been the presence from so many different, global business players. And as you said, so many people are getting involved now. The Turkish companies, Moroccan companies, airlines, and then the concept of American companies are used to making their profit from high quality, high price goods.